Most people completely misunderstand what Jesus meant when he said, "Do not store up treasures on earth." They think he was commanding poverty, rejecting abundance, or telling us money is evil. But Joel Goldsmith revealed something far more profound that changes everything about how we relate to material prosperity and spiritual freedom. What if Jesus wasn't condemning wealth at all? What if he was revealing the secret to experiencing true abundance without the anxiety, fear, and spiritual bondage that comes from depending on material things for your security? This teaching isn't about rejecting prosperity, it's about discovering where real treasure actually exists. The truth is revolutionary. Jesus was exposing the invisible prison that traps people who believe their safety, worth, and happiness depend on accumulating earthly things. He was pointing to a dimension of supply that never runs out, never disappoints, and never leaves you feeling empty, no matter how much you possess. Understanding this principle transforms not just your relationship with money and possessions, but your entire experience of security, peace, and freedom in this world. This is the secret that Joel Goldsmith spent decades teaching to students worldwide. Joel Goldsmith taught that this passage reveals the fundamental spiritual principle of source. Where you believe your good comes from determines whether you experience freedom or bondage. When you store up treasures on earth, you're not just accumulating things. You're declaring that earth is your source, that matter is your supply, that physical things hold your security. This creates an invisible anxiety that poisons everything you possess. You can have millions in the bank and still feel desperately insecure because deep down, you know earthly treasures can be lost, stolen, destroyed, or simply fail to satisfy the deepest hunger of your soul. Your treasure becomes your master, and you become its anxious guardian, constantly worried about protecting what you have. But Jesus revealed that true treasure exists in a realm where moth and rust cannot corrupt, and thieves cannot break through and steal. He was pointing to consciousness itself, to the infinite invisible supply that flows from spiritual awareness rather than material accumulation. This is where Joel's teaching becomes absolutely transformative for modern seekers. The shift from material source to spiritual source is the greatest liberation a human being can experience. It doesn't mean you lose earthly abundance. It means you finally enjoy it without fear enslaving you to it. The secret isn't rejecting material abundance or living in poverty to prove your spirituality. The secret is understanding that material things are effects, not causes. They're the visible expression of an invisible consciousness of completeness. When you try to store security in the effect rather than resting in the cause, you create the very insecurity you're trying to avoid. Joel taught that when your treasure is in heaven, in consciousness, in spiritual awareness of infinite supply, then earthly abundance flows naturally, without the burden of anxiety. You can enjoy prosperity without being enslaved by it. You can lose everything and know you've lost nothing because your source remains untouched. Your connection to infinite supply remains intact. This is the freedom Jesus was offering. Not poverty, but liberation from the tyranny of depending on things that can never truly satisfy or secure you. It's the difference between having things and things having you, between enjoying abundance and being consumed by the fear of losing it. This distinction changes everything. When you grasp this truth, you stop chasing security in bank accounts and start resting in the infinite substance of consciousness itself. That's when real abundance begins to manifest effortlessly. Here's what makes this teaching so radical. Jesus wasn't giving a rule about how much you can own. He was revealing a consciousness shift that frees you from spiritual slavery. The problem isn't having earthly treasures. The problem is storing your sense of security, identity, and worth in them, instead of in the imperishable treasure of spiritual consciousness. Joel explained it this way: when you know that your life, your supply, your good comes from the infinite invisible, then material things become simply the form that abundance takes today, not the source of that abundance. You hold them lightly, enjoy them freely, and release them easily because you know the source can never be diminished. This is why people who store treasures on earth are never satisfied. They accumulate more and more, yet the anxiety grows. They build bigger barns, larger portfolios, greater security systems, but the fear of loss intensifies. They're drinking salt water to quench their thirst, each sip creating greater desperation. But the person whose treasure is in heaven, in consciousness, experiences a peace that the world cannot give and cannot take away. Their security rests in something that moth, rust, thieves, economic crashes, and even death itself cannot touch or diminish. Let me share how this principle transformed Amanda's life. She was a successful attorney with everything the world calls treasure. A 7-figure income, a mansion, luxury cars, designer everything. But she couldn't sleep at night. Every market fluctuation sent her into panic. Every expense felt like a threat. She was wealthy and miserable. Then she encountered Joel Goldsmith's teachings on this very principle. At first, she resisted. She thought it meant she had to give everything away, become poor, reject her success. But as she studied deeper, she realized Jesus and Joel were pointing to something entirely different, something that would free her without requiring her to lose anything. She began practicing the consciousness of heaven as her treasure. Each morning, before checking her bank balance or stock portfolio, she spent 30 minutes in spiritual awareness, recognizing that her true supply was the infinite consciousness of God, not the digits in her accounts. This wasn't denial of the material, it was proper relationship with it. Over 6 months, something extraordinary happened. Her income actually increased, but her anxiety completely dissolved. She enjoyed her possessions without being possessed by them. She could give generously without fear. She had found the secret of having all things and holding nothing. Or consider Robert, a factory worker who barely made ends meet. He had almost nothing by worldly standards, yet he was tormented by the fear of losing even that little. He stored up his meager treasures on earth with the same anxiety as the wealthy, proving that the issue isn't how much you have, but where you believe your security comes from. Joel's teaching reached Robert through a friend. He started with deep skepticism. How could someone with so little afford to stop depending on earthly treasure? But he was desperate enough to try. He began each day acknowledging that his life, his breath, his supply came from an infinite, invisible source, not from his paycheck or savings account. The first shift was internal. The constant knot of anxiety in his stomach began to loosen. He started sleeping better. Then, opportunities began appearing that he'd never noticed before. Within a year, he'd been promoted twice. His income tripled. But more importantly, he was free. Free from the terror that had dominated his life. He later said the greatest treasure he found wasn't the increased income. It was the realization that he could never be truly poor because his source was inexhaustible. That consciousness was worth more than any amount of money stored on earth. Jessica's story reveals another dimension of this truth. She was a philanthropist who gave away millions, thinking that by not storing treasures for herself, she was following Jesus' teaching. But Joel Goldsmith showed her she was still operating from the same material consciousness, just expressing it differently. She was still believing that earthly treasures were the real treasure. Her giving came from a sense of guilt about having wealth, from a belief that money was somehow spiritually dangerous. She was storing up treasures in heaven by getting rid of treasures on earth, but she hadn't yet discovered what Jesus actually meant. She was still trapped in material consciousness, just inverting it. When she grasped Joel's teaching, everything shifted. She realized that treasure in heaven meant consciousness of infinite supply, not the absence of earthly abundance. She could have wealth, enjoy wealth, and give wealth all from a place of spiritual freedom rather than material attachment or guilt. The treasure wasn't the money given or kept, it was the consciousness from which both flowed. She continued giving generously, but now from overflow rather than obligation, from joy rather than fear. And paradoxically, her wealth increased because she'd stopped the unconscious self-punishment that had been blocking her reception of abundance. She'd found true treasure. These 3 stories reveal the same principle working in completely different circumstances. Whether you have much or little, whether you give generously or save carefully, the question remains the same. Where is your treasure? Is your security, your sense of safety, your peace of mind dependent on what you can see, count, and control? Or have you discovered the imperishable treasure of spiritual consciousness? Joel Goldsmith taught that when your treasure is truly in heaven, in consciousness, then your relationship with everything on earth transforms. You're no longer driven by fear or greed. You're no longer anxious about loss or consumed by desire for more. You rest in an infinite supply that expresses itself in whatever forms are needed, when they're needed. This is the freedom Jesus promised. Not freedom from having things, but freedom from things having you. Not poverty, but the consciousness of abundance that can never be diminished. Not rejecting the world, but relating to it from the imperishable rather than the perishable. This is the treasure worth seeking above all else. If these transformation stories inspire you to discover where true treasure exists, like this video to help others find freedom from material bondage, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom that liberates. And comment, which story resonated most deeply with your own journey toward spiritual freedom? Now let's explore the practical technique Joel Goldsmith gave for shifting your treasure from earth to heaven. This isn't theoretical philosophy, it's a daily practice that rewires your consciousness from material dependency to spiritual freedom. The technique is simple but requires consistency over weeks and months to fully transform your awareness. Each morning, before you check your bank balance, read the news, or engage with any material concern, spend at least 15 minutes in what Joel called the practice of recognizing your source. Sit quietly and consciously acknowledge that your life, breath, health, intelligence, and supply come from infinite invisible consciousness, not from any material condition. You're not denying that you have a job, a bank account, or possessions. You're establishing the proper relationship. These are effects of consciousness, not causes. They're the visible form of the invisible treasure, not the treasure itself. This practice gradually dissolves the unconscious belief that matter is your source and replaces it with conscious awareness of spiritual supply. At first, this may feel like pretending or denying reality. But Joel insisted that you're actually waking up to reality. The material is temporary. The spiritual is permanent. You've been depending on shadows and calling them substance. Now you're learning to rest in actual substance and watch the shadows take proper form. The second part of this practice involves what Joel called the moment of temptation. Throughout your day, whenever anxiety about money, possessions, or security arises, that's your signal. Instead of trying to solve the anxiety by manipulating material conditions, you pause and return to the recognition. My treasure is in heaven, in consciousness, in the infinite invisible that can never be diminished. This doesn't mean you don't take practical action. It means your action comes from peace rather than panic, from wisdom rather than fear. When your treasure is in heaven, you make better decisions about earthly things because you're not desperate. Desperation makes poor choices. Freedom makes wise ones. Brian practiced this technique for 3 months while facing potential bankruptcy. Every time terror gripped him about losing his business, he would stop, breathe, and consciously recognize that his true treasure, his real supply, existed in a dimension untouchable by business failure. Then he would address the practical issues from that consciousness. What happened surprised him. Solutions appeared that he'd been too panicked to see before. Opportunities emerged from unexpected sources. His business didn't just survive, it transformed into something more aligned with his actual gifts. He later realized the bankruptcy threat was actually pushing him toward his true treasure. Joel also taught a third element, the practice of gratitude for the invisible. Most people only feel grateful for visible, tangible blessings, but when your treasure is in heaven, you become consciously grateful for the infinite invisible supply itself, regardless of its current material form. This gratitude is magnetic, drawing more visible expression from the invisible treasure. Nicole was drowning in debt while practicing this principle. It felt absurd to be grateful when her material circumstances were dire, but she understood Joel's point. Her gratitude wasn't for the debt. It was for the infinite consciousness that was her true supply, the imperishable treasure that the debt couldn't touch or diminish. She spent 10 minutes each evening specifically thanking the invisible for being her source, for being infinite, for being present regardless of material appearance. Not thanking for what she hoped would manifest, but thanking for the treasure in heaven that already existed as her true security. This shifted something deep in her consciousness. Within 8 months, the debt was completely resolved through a series of opportunities and solutions she could never have orchestrated. But more valuable than the debt relief was the treasure she'd discovered, a consciousness of supply that no material circumstance could threaten. That treasure remained long after the debt was forgotten. The fourth practice Joel recommended is what he called living from the invisible to the visible rather than from the visible to the visible. This means you stop trying to get material results from material manipulation alone. Instead, you establish consciousness first, then let it express as material form. Most people try to rearrange Earth to produce more Earth. They work harder to make more money, to buy more security, to feel more safe. It's earth to earth, matter to matter, visible to visible. And it never produces lasting peace because you're building on perishable foundation. You're storing treasures where moth and rust corrupt. But when you live from invisible to visible, you first establish the consciousness of abundance, completeness, and infinite supply in your awareness. You dwell in that treasure in heaven until it becomes real to you. Then you watch it express as whatever material form is appropriate. You're building on imperishable foundation. Kevin applied this to his failing marriage. He'd been trying to fix the relationship by changing behaviors, words, and actions, all visible to visible. Nothing worked. Then he began establishing the consciousness of divine love as his treasure first, letting that invisible treasure transform him from within. The marriage healed naturally as the invisible became visible. But let's be honest about the obstacles you'll face when practicing this principle. The biggest challenge is the mind's resistance to trusting what it cannot see, touch, or measure. Your entire life you've been trained to trust only the visible, to believe only in what can be counted and controlled. Shifting to treasure in heaven feels like stepping off a cliff. Daniel struggled with this intensely. Every time he tried to rest in invisible supply, his mind would scream about bills due, obligations pending, security threatened. The old consciousness of Earth as source would flood back with overwhelming force. He'd panic and abandon the practice, returning to frantic material manipulation that never brought peace. Joel addressed this exact challenge. He taught that the resistance is actually the old consciousness fighting for survival. It knows that if you truly shift your treasure to heaven, its tyranny over you ends. So it will throw every fearful thought, every dire scenario, every logical argument at you to pull you back to material dependency. The solution isn't to fight these thoughts, but to gently, persistently return to the practice. When fear screams about material lack, you quietly acknowledge, my treasure is in heaven, in consciousness, and it can never be diminished. You don't argue with the fear, you simply rest in a higher truth. Over time, the fear loses its power. Another major obstacle is the judgment of others who think you're being irresponsible by not storing up earthly treasures. Friends, family, even spiritual teachers will tell you that you need to be practical, realistic, secure your future through material accumulation. They mean well, but they're speaking from the consciousness Jesus was challenging. Melissa faced this when she quit her high-paying corporate job to follow her true calling with far less income security. Everyone told her she was foolish, irresponsible, storing up nothing for the future. Even her church friends quoted scripture about the ants storing food for winter, completely missing what Jesus actually taught about treasure. But Melissa had grasped Joel's teaching. She wasn't being irresponsible. She was shifting her source from earth to heaven. She wasn't rejecting practical planning. She was establishing spiritual consciousness as foundation. And she discovered that heaven's treasure provided more abundantly than earth's hoarding ever had. The judgment continued for months, but her results spoke louder. She thrived. Her needs were met in ways that defied material logic. And slowly, some of those who judged her began asking questions. They'd witnessed someone living from treasure in heaven, and it challenged everything they believed about security. A third obstacle is the subtle temptation to use this teaching as spiritual bypass. Some people hear treasure in heaven and think it means they can ignore bills, avoid work, reject financial responsibility, and just wait for consciousness to magically provide. This completely misses Joel's point and creates suffering. Treasure in heaven doesn't mean no earthly action. It means earthly action flows from spiritual consciousness rather than material desperation. You still work, plan, save, and act responsibly, but you do it all from the foundation of knowing your source is the infinite invisible, not the finite visible. The consciousness determines the quality and effectiveness of your action. Andrew fell into this trap. He quit his job, stopped paying bills, and declared he was living from treasure in heaven. Predictably, disaster followed. He'd confused spiritual awareness with material irresponsibility. Joel would have corrected him immediately. Recognizing heaven as your treasure empowers wise earthly action. It doesn't replace it. When Andrew finally understood, he returned to work, but with completely transformed consciousness. He worked from overflow rather than desperation, from creative expression rather than survival fear. His income increased, his stress decreased, and he finally understood what treasure in heaven actually meant. It was consciousness that transformed action, not consciousness that eliminated it. The fourth obstacle is the collapse that sometimes happens when old material structures dissolve before new ones appear. When you stop storing treasures on earth and start resting in heaven's treasure, there's often a transitional period where the old falls away but the new hasn't yet manifested. This tests whether your treasure is truly in heaven. Catherine experienced this. As she shifted to spiritual consciousness as her source, her old income streams dried up. For 4 months, nothing visible supported her. Every survival instinct screamed to abandon the practice and return to material dependency. But she'd tasted the treasure in heaven and couldn't go back to earth as her source. Joel taught that this wilderness period is where most people fail the test. They panic when the visible disappears and rush back to storing earthly treasures. But if you can remain conscious that your treasure is in heaven during the collapse of earthly structures, the invisible will manifest in forms far greater than what dissolved. Catherine held steady. In the 5th month, opportunities appeared that were perfectly aligned with her gifts and values, providing more abundantly than the old structures ever had. But more importantly, she'd proven to herself that her treasure truly was in heaven. That consciousness became unshakable, worth more than any amount of material security. If these obstacle-breaking techniques resonate with your journey, like to support transformative content, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings on spiritual freedom, and comment. Which obstacle are you ready to transform by shifting your treasure from earth to heaven? Now let's explore advanced integration of this principle in daily life. Once you've established that your treasure is in heaven, how do you navigate the practical world of mortgages, investments, retirement planning, and financial responsibility without falling back into material consciousness? This is where Joel's teaching becomes incredibly nuanced and powerful. The key is understanding that treasure in heaven doesn't reject earthly planning, it redeems it. You can have investments, savings, insurance, and retirement accounts, but you hold them all from the consciousness that these are visible expressions of invisible supply, not your actual security. The bank account is the form, consciousness is the substance. Never confuse the two. William is a financial advisor who helps others plan for material security. When he discovered Joel's teaching, he wondered if his entire career contradicted spiritual truth. But he came to see that helping people manage earthly resources responsibly is valuable service when done from the consciousness that heaven is the true treasure. Now, William helps clients create financial plans while also teaching them that the plans are tools, not sources. The portfolio is the form of abundance today, not the cause of abundance itself. This transforms his clients' relationship with their wealth from anxiety to peace, from grasping to stewardship. He's teaching treasure in heaven through the language of earth. Another advanced application involves giving and receiving. When your treasure is in heaven, giving becomes natural and joyful because you're not depleting your source by giving material things. You're simply allowing the infinite invisible to flow through you into visible form for others. The source remains infinite regardless of how much flows through. Stephanie discovered this when she began giving far beyond what seemed financially prudent. Her accountant was horrified, but Stephanie understood that her treasure was in heaven, in infinite consciousness, not in her bank balance. She could give abundantly because she was giving from an inexhaustible source, not from a limited material supply. What happened challenged all conventional financial wisdom. The more she gave from consciousness of infinite supply, the more flowed to her from unexpected sources. Not because giving mechanically produces receiving, but because consciousness of infinite treasure naturally expresses as both abundant giving and abundant receiving. It's all the same infinite flow. She now teaches others that when you try to give from earth consciousness, from limited material awareness, giving feels depleting and scary. But when you give from heaven consciousness, from awareness of infinite supply, giving feels like opening a faucet connected to an endless reservoir. The consciousness determines the experience completely. The principle also transforms how you handle financial crisis and material loss. When layoffs come, when investments fail, when unexpected expenses arise, these are the moments that reveal where your treasure truly is. If your treasure is on earth, these moments bring panic. If your treasure is in heaven, these moments bring opportunity to deepen in truth. Jonathan lost everything in an economic collapse. His retirement savings, his home equity, his investment portfolio all vanished. By worldly standards, he was ruined, but he'd spent years establishing his treasure in heaven, in consciousness of infinite supply. The material loss couldn't touch his actual treasure. He spent the first week after the collapse simply resting in the awareness that his life, his supply, his good, came from the infinite invisible, not from the portfolio that had dissolved. He felt grief over the loss, but not desperation. His treasure remained intact. The forms had changed, but the substance was untouchable. Within 2 years, he'd rebuilt material abundance that exceeded what he'd lost, but from a completely different foundation. The old wealth had been built on earth consciousness. The new wealth was the visible expression of heaven consciousness. Same material result, completely different treasure. And this time, no economic collapse could threaten his real security. Perhaps the most advanced application is discovering that relationships, health, and purpose all follow the same principle as finances. You can store your treasure of love in earthly relationships that can be lost, or in the infinite love of consciousness itself that can never be lost. You can store your treasure of well-being in bodily health that fades, or in spiritual wholeness that death itself cannot diminish. Rachel had stored her treasure of identity and worth in her children. When they grew up and moved away, she fell into devastating depression. Her treasure had been on earth, in people who naturally changed and left. Joel's teaching reached her in that darkness and showed her she'd been depending on the wrong source for love. She began the practice of recognizing that love itself, infinite and eternal, was her treasure in heaven. Her children were beautiful expressions of that love, but not the source of it. The source was consciousness itself, always present, never leaving. This shift took months to establish, but it transformed everything. Her relationship with her children actually improved because she no longer needed them to fill the void only heaven could fill. She loved them freely rather than dependently, and she discovered dimensions of love, purpose, and joy that didn't require their presence. She'd found the treasure that people, even beloved people, could never provide. As we approach the completion of this teaching, let's recognize what you've discovered. You've learned that Jesus wasn't condemning abundance, but revealing the secret of experiencing prosperity without spiritual bondage. You've seen that treasure in heaven means consciousness of infinite supply, not rejection of material good. You've witnessed lives transformed by this shift in source. You've received practical techniques for establishing your treasure in heaven through daily recognition of your source, through moments of temptation transformed into moments of truth, through gratitude for the invisible, and through living from consciousness to form rather than form to form. These aren't theories, they're practices that rewire your entire relationship with security and supply. You've confronted the obstacles honestly, the mind's resistance to trusting the invisible, the judgment of others, the temptation to spiritual bypass, and the wilderness period when old structures dissolve. You've learned that these obstacles are actually opportunities to prove where your treasure truly is. They're the refinement process that establishes unshakable consciousness, and you've explored advanced integration in finances, giving, crisis, and even in relationships and health. Every area of life transforms when you shift your treasure from earth to heaven, from visible to invisible, from temporary to eternal. This is the comprehensive freedom Jesus offered, and Joel Goldsmith clarified for modern seekers. Now the question is, where will you choose to store your treasure? This isn't a one-time decision, but a daily practice, a moment-by-moment choice to rest in the invisible rather than grasp at the visible. Every time anxiety arises about money, security, or provision, that's your invitation to return to heaven as your treasure. The world will constantly tempt you to store treasures on earth, to believe that material accumulation equals security, that earthly possessions can satisfy the soul's deepest hunger. The entire economic system is built on this illusion. Every advertisement, Every financial fear-mongering, every comparison with others reinforces material consciousness. But you've been shown a different way. You've discovered that true treasure exists in a dimension untouchable by economic collapse, market volatility, theft, loss, or even death. You've learned that consciousness of infinite supply is the only real security, the only treasure worth seeking above all else. The practice is simple but requires daily commitment. Each morning, establish your treasure in heaven through conscious recognition of infinite supply. Throughout the day, whenever fear or desire arise around material things, return to that treasure. Each evening, rest in gratitude for the invisible source that never fails. This practice gradually transforms your entire experience of life from scarcity to abundance, from anxiety to peace. Joel Goldsmith spent his entire ministry teaching this one truth in countless forms. Your good comes from consciousness, from the infinite invisible, from what he called heaven or God or spirit. The material world is the effect, never the cause. When you store your treasure in the effect, you guarantee suffering. When you store your treasure in the cause, you guarantee freedom. This doesn't mean the material disappears or becomes irrelevant. It means the material takes its proper place as the servant rather than the master, as the form rather than the substance, as the expression rather than the source. You can enjoy earthly treasures without being enslaved by them. You can lose earthly treasures without losing your actual treasure. Think of your life 6 months from now, practicing this principle daily. Imagine waking without anxiety about money, going through your day without comparing your possessions to others, facing unexpected expenses without panic, enjoying what you have without fear of loss. This isn't fantasy. This is the natural result of storing your treasure in heaven. Now imagine your life 5 years from now, established in this consciousness. The world's economic chaos doesn't shake you. Material gain or loss doesn't define your worth or security. You give freely, receive gratefully, and rest constantly in the awareness of infinite supply. You found the treasure Jesus promised, the pearl of great price worth everything. So here is your invitation into transformation. Begin today, right now, with this simple practice. Place your hand on your heart and say internally, "My treasure is in heaven, in consciousness, in the infinite invisible that can never be diminished." Feel the truth of that statement. Let it sink deeper than intellectual understanding into actual awareness. Tomorrow morning, before checking your phone or engaging the material world, spend 15 minutes consciously recognizing that your life, your breath, your supply comes from infinite consciousness, not from any earthly source. Don't try to feel anything special, just establish the recognition. Let it become the foundation of your day. Throughout this week, whenever anxiety about money or security arises, pause and return to the awareness. My treasure is in heaven. Let that truth interrupt the pattern of material dependency. Watch how it shifts your decisions, your peace, your actual experience. This is how consciousness transforms into demonstration. You've received the teaching that Jesus gave and Joel Goldsmith clarified. The treasure exists. Heaven is real. Infinite supply is your birthright. Now comes your choice. Will you store your treasure on earth where it can be lost, or in heaven where it remains forever? Everything in your life flows from how you answer that question. Choose wisely, choose daily, and choose freedom. If your understanding of true treasure has been transformed through these Joel Goldsmith teachings, like this video to help others discover freedom from material bondage, subscribe for more consciousness-expanding spiritual wisdom, and comment, "My treasure is in heaven," to confirm your shift from earthly anxiety to spiritual freedom.
What if I told you that the very thing you've been taught would make you secure accumulating, saving, storing up for tomorrow, is actually the source of your deepest anxiety? What if the freedom you seek doesn't come from having more, but from understanding something so profound about the nature of supply that you could walk through life with empty hands and a full heart? Stay with me, because what we're about to explore will turn everything you thought you knew about abundance completely inside out. My dear friends, we have all heard these words from the Sermon on the Mount, haven't we? Do not store up treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. And what have we done with them? Most of us have either ignored them as impractical mysticism, or we've twisted them into a doctrine that says spirituality requires poverty, that God somehow favors the poor and looks suspiciously upon the prosperous. But neither of these interpretations touches the truth that Christ was revealing. Neither sets anyone free. Let me share with you what I have come to understand through years of meditation and practice, not as theology but as living experience. The Master was not teaching poverty. He was teaching something far more radical. He was teaching freedom from the tyranny of things. And there is a vast difference between poverty and freedom. You see, when we store up treasures on earth, we are doing something very specific in consciousness. We are saying, my good, my security, my future. All of this depends on what I can accumulate and hold on to in the visible realm. We are placing our faith, our trust, our very sense of being in things. And the moment we do this, we become enslaved to those things. Think about it honestly for a moment. When your sense of security rests in your bank account, what happens? You must constantly worry about that bank account. When it grows, you feel temporary relief. When it shrinks, you feel anxiety. You are not free, you are bound. You have made yourself a prisoner of numbers on a page. When your sense of well-being depends on your possessions, you must guard them, insure them, protect them. You must fear their loss. You must fear the thief, the moth, the rust, the stock market crash, the economic downturn. Your mind cannot rest because it must constantly attend to the security of these external things. This is not freedom, this is bondage. But here is the beautiful truth that the Master was revealing. There is a treasure that cannot be stolen. There is a supply that cannot be depleted. There is a security that cannot be threatened. And that treasure, that supply, that security exists in consciousness, in your awareness of the infinite, invisible presence that is the source of all that is. Let me be very clear about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not saying you should not have money. I am not saying you should not have possessions. I am not saying you should give everything away and live in poverty. The material forms of good are not the problem. The problem is where we place our faith. When we place our faith in the things themselves, we are looking to the created rather than the creator, to the effect rather than the cause, to the finite rather than the infinite. And this is the source of all our anxiety and fear. But when we place our faith in the invisible presence, in the infinite source from which all good flows, something miraculous happens. We discover that supply is not a matter of accumulation but of realization. We discover that we don't need to store up treasures because we have access to the storehouse itself. Think of it this way. If you lived next door to an infinite spring of fresh water, would you need to hoard water in your house? Would you need barrels and containers filling every room, anxiously guarded, constantly counted? Of course not. You would simply go to the spring whenever you needed water. You would know the water is always there, always flowing, always available. This is what the Master was teaching. This is the truth that sets you free. The kingdom of heaven, which means the realm of infinite supply, infinite good, infinite grace, is within you. It is in your consciousness. It is in your awareness of the presence. And this awareness is the only treasure you need, because from this awareness flows everything else. Now, how do we make this practical? How do we live this truth? First, we must begin each day in conscious awareness of the presence. Before we think about our bank account, our job, our bills, our needs, we must first establish ourselves in the awareness that I and the Father are one. We must feel this presence within us as our very life, our very breath, our very being. This is not affirmation. This is not trying to convince ourselves of something. This is simply becoming still enough to recognize what is already true, that the infinite invisible source of all life is present within us right now, and that this presence is our supply. Second, we must practice living from this inner awareness rather than from external appearances. When appearances suggest lack, when the bank account is low, when the bills exceed the income, we do not panic. We do not frantically try to manipulate the outer world. We return to the awareness of the presence. We rest in that infinite source, and we let the forms of supply appear as they will. This requires great practice and discipline. The human mind is so conditioned to react to appearances, to try to solve problems through outer manipulation. But each time we catch ourselves reacting from fear, we can pause, become still, and remember, the invisible presence is my supply. My good flows from within, not from without. Third, we must learn the art of non-attachment. This does not mean we don't enjoy things. It doesn't mean we live without appreciation or gratitude. It means we hold all things lightly, knowing that the things themselves are not our good, they are simply the current form our good is taking. I may have money in the bank today. That is a form of good. Tomorrow, that money may flow out to meet some need, and another form of good may flow in, perhaps an opportunity, perhaps a gift, perhaps something I cannot yet imagine. I don't cling to the money because the money is not my treasure. My treasure is the awareness of infinite supply, and that awareness remains constant even as the forms change. This is how we store up treasures in heaven, which means we store up treasures in consciousness, in the invisible realm of awareness, in the kingdom within. And these treasures cannot be stolen because no external circumstance can touch our inner awareness. These treasures cannot rust or decay because consciousness is eternal, unchanging, infinite. Do you see the freedom in this? Do you see what the Master was offering us? When we live from this consciousness, we are free to be generous because we know our good does not depend on what we hold on to. We are free to take risks because we know our security is not in visible things. We are free to give because we know the source is infinite and inexhaustible. We can even be rich, yes, abundantly rich in material things without being possessed by those things, without being anxious about those things, without making an idol of those things. We can enjoy them as the temporary forms of good that they are, while resting our true sense of being in the eternal presence that is the source of all good. This is the narrow way that few find. Not the way of poverty, not the way of renunciation, but the way of freedom, freedom from fear, freedom from anxiety, freedom from the tyranny of trying to secure ourselves through accumulation. My friends, I invite you to experiment with this truth. Just for today, just for this moment, what would it be like to rest all your sense of security in the awareness of the infinite presence within you? What would it be like to stop mentally counting your resources and instead simply abide in the knowledge that the source of all resources is present within you now? This is not denial of your human responsibilities. You still do what wisdom suggests in the outer realm, but you do it from a place of inner freedom rather than inner desperation. You manage your affairs, but you are not enslaved by them. You work, you plan, you act, but all of it flows from an inner awareness of infinite supply rather than from fear of lack. This is the truth about not storing up treasures on earth. It is not a command to be poor, it is an invitation to be free, free from fear, free from anxiety, free to live fully, love generously, and rest in the infinite, invisible presence that is the source, substance, and supply of all that you are and all that you will ever need. The treasure is already within you. You don't need to accumulate it. You need only to become aware of it. And that awareness, my dear friends, is the only treasure you will ever need, because from that awareness, all else flows. True treasure lies in consciousness, not possessions, my friends. Let us understand something fundamental about the nature of reality. Everything you see in the visible world, your home, your money, your possessions, these are all effects. They are the outer manifestations of an inner cause, and that cause is consciousness. When the Master taught us not to store up treasures on earth, he was revealing a profound metaphysical principle. The only thing you truly possess is your state of consciousness, your awareness of truth, your realization of the presence. Everything else is temporary, changing, subject to the conditions of this world. Think about it this way. You could lose every material possession tomorrow, through fire, through theft, through economic collapse, and yet if you have the consciousness of supply, if you have the awareness of the infinite source, you can rebuild, you can start again. The invisible treasure remains intact, but if you have $1 million and lack consciousness, lack awareness, lack inner peace, then you are poor indeed. You are anxious, fearful, constantly defending what you have. The $1 million possesses you more than you possess it. True treasure is the understanding that I and the Father are one. True treasure is the realization that the kingdom of God is within. True treasure is the consciousness that recognizes the infinite invisible presence as the source and substance of all good. This consciousness goes with you everywhere. It cannot be taxed, stolen, or diminished. It is eternal, infinite, and always available. When we store up this treasure in consciousness, we discover something remarkable. The outer forms of good begin to appear naturally, effortlessly, as the expression of our inner awareness. We are no longer begging, struggling, or manipulating for supply. We are simply being aware of what is already true, and that awareness manifests as our experience. The principle of supply versus things there is a crucial distinction we must make if we are to understand the Master's teaching. We must distinguish between the principle of supply and the things that supply takes form as. This distinction is the difference between freedom and bondage. Things are finite, limited, subject to gain and loss. The principle of supply is infinite, unlimited, eternal. Things come and go, appear and disappear, increase and decrease. The principle remains constant, unchanging, ever-present. When we seek security in things, we are building our house on sand. Things can be lost, stolen, destroyed. The stock market crashes, the economy fails, the investment loses value, the business closes. If our sense of security rests in these things, we live in constant fear of their loss. But when we understand the principle, when we understand that there is an infinite invisible source from which all things flow, we are building our house on rock. We are establishing our consciousness in that which cannot be shaken. The principle of supply is simply this: God, the infinite invisible presence, is the source of all that is. This presence is omnipresent, which means it is present right where you are. This presence is infinite, which means it can never be depleted. This presence is expressing itself as your individual life, and therefore you have access to infinite supply through your awareness of this presence. Now, this supply will take different forms at different times. Sometimes it appears as money, sometimes as opportunity, sometimes as an idea, a contact, a gift, or a resource you hadn't considered. The forms are always changing, but the principle, the infinite source, remains constant. When we live from the principle rather than from things, we are not disturbed by the changing forms. Money flows out. We don't panic because we know the source remains. One form of supply ends, we remain at peace, knowing another form will appear. We are not attached to the how, the when, or the what. We are simply aware of the infinite source, and we let it express itself as it will, freedom through non-attachment. Here we touch upon one of the most liberating truths in all of spiritual teaching. Non-attachment is not the absence of enjoyment, it is the absence of dependence. Non-attachment means we can have all things and enjoy all things while remaining inwardly free of all things. The world teaches us attachment from childhood. We are taught to find our identity in what we have, our security in what we've accumulated, our worth in what we can display, and so we become enslaved. We cannot enjoy what we have because we are too busy fearing its loss. We cannot be at peace because our peace depends on maintaining and increasing our possessions. But the spiritual path teaches us something different. It teaches us that we can walk through this world with our hands full but our hearts empty, empty of dependence, empty of fear, empty of the desperate clinging that makes us prisoners. I am not suggesting we should not work, should not earn, should not have. Not at all. I am suggesting that we can have these things without being had by them. We can enjoy prosperity without being possessed by it. We can use money without serving it. This is the freedom the Master was teaching. When you know that your good comes from the infinite source within, you can enjoy the things of this world without fear. You can appreciate them without worship. You can use them without being used by them. If they remain, wonderful. If they go, equally wonderful. Your treasure, your awareness of the presence, your consciousness of infinite supply remains untouched. You are free. This freedom allows us to be truly generous, truly courageous, truly creative. We are not paralyzed by the fear of loss. We are not calculating every move based on material advantage. We are free to follow the highest guidance, to give where giving is needed, to risk where risk is appropriate, because our security is not in things, but in the infinite, invisible presence. The illusion of security in material things, let us look honestly at what happens when we seek security in material accumulation. The more we accumulate, the more we must protect. The larger our holdings, the greater our anxiety about maintaining them. We think we are building security, but we are actually building a prison of fear. I have known people with great wealth who could not sleep at night for worry. I have known people with multiple properties who were enslaved by the management of them. I have known people with substantial investments who lived in constant anxiety about market conditions. Is this security or is this bondage? The illusion is that if we just had enough money, enough assets, enough stored up for the future, we could finally relax and feel secure. But that enough never comes. There is always something more to worry about, some new threat to guard against, some additional accumulation that seems necessary. This is because true security cannot be found in things. Things are part of the world of effects, and effects are always changing, always subject to conditions beyond our control. To seek security in effects is to seek security in quicksand. Real security can only be found in consciousness, in the awareness of that which does not change, that which cannot be threatened, that which is infinite and eternal. Real security is the inner knowing that the source of all good is present within you now and always. When you have this inner security, you are not careless or irresponsible with material things. You still manage your affairs wisely, but you are no longer imprisoned by them. You are no longer awake at night counting and recounting your resources in fear. You are at peace, knowing that your life is sustained by the infinite, invisible presence. and that this presence will always provide the form of supply appropriate to each moment. The great paradox is this: when we stop seeking security in accumulation and instead rest in the awareness of infinite supply, we often find that material good flows more abundantly and easily than ever before. Why? Because we are no longer blocking the flow with fear and anxiety. Living from the invisible, this is perhaps the most practical and yet most mystical of all the principles. Living from the invisible means that we draw our life, our strength, our supply, our guidance, everything from the realm of spirit rather than from the realm of visible effects. Most people live entirely from the visible. They look at their circumstances and react to what they see. Bank account low, panic and worry, health declining, fear and anxiety, opportunities scarce, desperation and grasping. They are constantly responding to the outer world, trying to manipulate effects, attempting to solve problems on the level of effects. But the spiritual aspirant learns to live differently. We learn to close our eyes to the outer appearances and open our inner eye to the invisible presence. We learn to be still and know that I am God, that the infinite presence is present within us as our very being. This is not denial of what appears in the outer world. This is recognition of what is true in the inner realm. And as we abide in this inner awareness, as we live from this invisible source, we discover that the outer world begins to conform to our inner realization. Living from the invisible requires daily practice. Each morning, before we engage with the world of effects, we must first establish ourselves in the awareness of the presence. We become still, we feel the presence within. We acknowledge that this presence is our life, our supply, our wisdom, our guide. Throughout the day, whenever we are tempted to react to appearances, we pause. We return to the invisible. We remember that what we see is not the whole truth. There is an invisible reality of infinite supply, infinite wisdom, infinite love, and this invisible reality is more real than what appears to the physical senses. This is the secret of the contemplative life lived in the midst of the world. We are here, active, engaged, responsible, but we are drawing our life from the invisible source rather than from visible conditions, and in this way we remain free, the freedom that awaits you. My dear friends, we have journeyed together through a profound truth today, a truth that has the power to completely transform your relationship with this world and everything in it. The Master's teaching, "Do not store up treasures on earth," is not a burden to bear, but a key to unlock the prison door we have built around ourselves. Let me leave you with this understanding. You are not being asked to give up anything real. You are not being asked to live in poverty or to reject the good things of life. You are simply being invited to shift your consciousness from dependence on effects to awareness of the cause, from faith in things to faith in the infinite presence. This shift does not happen overnight. It is a practice, a daily discipline of returning again and again to the awareness of the invisible source within. Some days you will forget. Some days the appearances will seem so real, so pressing, so urgent that you will find yourself slipping back into the old patterns of fear and anxiety. This is natural. This is part of the journey. But each time you catch yourself, each time you pause in the midst of worry and remember, wait, my treasure is not in these things, my treasure is in consciousness. You are taking a step toward freedom. Each time you choose to rest in the awareness of the presence rather than react to appearances, you are strengthening your spiritual consciousness. And gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, you will notice something changing. You will notice that you are sleeping better at night. You will notice that the financial anxieties that once consumed you are loosening their grip. You will notice that you can be generous without fear, that you can take risks without panic, that you can face uncertainty with an inner calm you never knew was possible. This is not because your outer circumstances have necessarily changed, though they often do, and usually for the better. This is because you have changed. You have discovered the treasure that moth and rust cannot corrupt, that thieves cannot break in and steal. You have discovered the kingdom of heaven within. Remember this, the infinite invisible presence that has brought you this far in your journey, that has sustained you through every challenge, that has provided for you in ways seen and unseen. This presence has not abandoned you. It is with you now. It is you now. It is the very life that breathes you, the consciousness that knows itself as I am. You do not need to create this presence. You do not need to earn it or deserve it or qualify for it. You need only to recognize it, to become aware of it, to rest in it. And from this awareness, everything else flows. So I leave you with this practice, beginning today, before your feet touch the floor in the morning, before you check your phone or think about your schedule or worry about your day, take just 5 minutes to be still and know. Feel the presence within you. Acknowledge the infinite source that is your life. Say quietly to yourself, the kingdom of God is within me. I and the Father are one. My treasure is in consciousness, and this treasure is infinite and eternal. Carry this awareness with you throughout your day. When fear arises, return to it. When anxiety threatens, rest in it. When appearances suggest lack, remember it. This is your treasure. This is your security. This is your freedom. The truth about not storing up treasures on earth is simply this. You don't need to store up treasures because you already have access to the infinite treasure house of spirit. You don't need to secure your future because you are one with the eternal presence that is both your past and your future, your Alpha and your Omega. Walk in this freedom, my friends. Live from this awareness, and discover for yourself what countless spiritual seekers throughout the ages have discovered, that the kingdom of heaven is not something you attain, it is something you awaken to. It has been within you all along, waiting quietly for your recognition. This is the truth that sets you free, not free from responsibility, not free from action, not free from living fully in this world, but free from fear, free from anxiety, free from the tyranny of dependence on things that change and pass away. The treasure is yours, the kingdom is within you, the presence is with you now and always. Go in peace, and may your awareness of the infinite invisible source be your constant companion, your unfailing supply, and your eternal treasure. Thank you, and God bless you. Think you truly know God? Then consider this: what you call knowing is often only believing. To believe in God is not the same as knowing God. Belief lives in the mind, in the realm of words, rituals, and doctrines. Knowing, however, is born of direct awareness, the silent communion where thought falls away and only presence remains. You may read sacred books, attend gatherings, and speak reverently of the infinite, yet still walk in the shadow of separation. For as long as God is out there, somewhere beyond you, unseen and untouchable, you have not yet awakened to the living reality within. The human mind seeks a God it can define, one who answers prayers, punishes sins, and rewards goodness. But that is not God. That is man's concept of God, and all concepts veil the truth. True knowing begins when you surrender every idea of what God should be. When you cease to reach outward, and instead rest inwardly in stillness, you begin to taste the presence that has never been absent. It is not a being apart from you, it is the life animating your every breath. the consciousness behind your thoughts, the love that stirs quietly beneath all fear. When you touch that sacred depth, you realize God was never to be found in form, image, or word. God is not something to be attained but revealed. Revealed when the noisy mind grows silent, when the self that seeks dissolves into the vastness of the self that is. In that instant, knowing and being become one. Do not say you know God because you have felt peace or joy. These are but reflections of the infinite, not the infinite itself. The true experience of God leaves no you to describe it. There is only light, only awareness, only the deep hush of eternity. So, to know God is to unknow everything else, to lay down your opinions, your theologies, even your longing, until only pure awareness remains. In that sacred silence, you discover what has always been true. You were never apart from the divine. The knower, the knowing, and the known, all are one life, one consciousness, one infinite love. Belief is not knowing. Merely believing in God through doctrine or tradition is not the same as truly knowing God. Belief lives in the mind, while true knowing arises in direct spiritual awareness. God is within, not apart. The divine is not an external being to be sought, but the living presence that dwells within and animates all life. Silence reveals the divine. Only in inner stillness, when thoughts and concepts dissolve, can one experience the true presence of God. Letting go of concepts, every image, idea, or description of God limits the infinite. To know God, one must release all human-made notions and surrender to pure awareness. Oneness of existence in true realization. The seeker, the search, and the sought are seen as one. There is no separation between the human and the divine, only one consciousness expressing as all. To believe in God is an act of the mind. To know God is the awakening of the soul. Belief is built from words, teachings, and the thoughts of others. It grows through repetition, shaped by the stories and doctrines we inherit. It comforts the intellect, giving it something to hold on to. A name, a form, a promise. But knowing God is not born from learning or repetition. It arises in the stillness beyond thought, in the moment when the mind becomes silent and awareness takes its rightful place as the only reality. Belief belongs to time. It has a beginning and can change. You once believed one thing, now you believe another, and tomorrow you may believe differently again. But knowing does not shift, for it is not held by the mind. It is realized by the Spirit. It is not, I think God is, but I am, and that being is God. This knowing is not about a being you reach toward, but about the recognition of what has always been your own essence. Belief often seeks to persuade, it argues, it defends. It says, this is true, and that is false. It separates people into those who believe and those who do not. Knowing has no such divisions. When the heart awakens to God, it sees no believer and no unbeliever, no right or wrong doctrine, only the one life flowing through all. It cannot be explained, only lived. And once touched by that realization, argument becomes unnecessary, for the truth reveals itself in every breath. In belief, one prays to a God who listens. In knowing, one becomes the silence in which the prayer itself dissolves. Belief speaks of heaven as a place to arrive. Knowing reveals heaven as the awareness that never left. Belief reaches outward for help and comfort. Knowing rests inward in unshakable peace. The difference is not small. It is the crossing from duality to unity, from searching to seeing. When you believe, you are still in motion toward something. When you know, all motion ceases, for there is nowhere to go and nothing to find. You discover that what you sought was never absent. The seeker disappears, and only the presence remains, silent, radiant, unbounded. Belief says, God loves me. Knowing whispers, I am love. Belief says, God will guide me. Knowing says, I and the guiding are one. Belief builds a bridge. Knowing walks no bridge, for there are no two shores to connect. This transition cannot be forced by effort or study. It happens when the mind exhausts its search, when it surrenders its need to understand. A door opens, not outward, but inward. The light that shines through that door is not new. It was always there, hidden behind the veil of belief. So long as one holds to belief alone, God remains an object of thought, confined by words and forms. But in the silence beyond thought, in that wordless space where self and God are not two, there dawns the pure knowing that cannot be lost. There, the knower and the known dissolve, leaving only being itself, limitless, eternal, and whole. The great illusion of the human mind is the idea that God exists somewhere outside of itself. Humanity has spent centuries reaching upward, outward, toward a distant power it hopes to please, obey, or discover. This search, though noble in intent, begins in separation, the sense that God is there, while we are here. Yet the moment one awakens from this illusion, it becomes clear that there was never a there at all. God is not apart from life, but the very essence of life itself. The breath moving through you, the awareness that perceives these words, the quiet intelligence that beats your heart, all of it is the living presence of the divine expressing as you. You do not have to call upon God as though calling for help from afar. God is not an external rescuer, not a distant king or cosmic ruler who responds to requests. Rather, the divine is the invisible substance of your being, the life force animating every thought, every action, every unfolding of your existence. When you speak, it is God speaking as you. When you love, it is God loving through you. The ocean does not live apart from its waves, nor does the infinite live apart from its creation. The mind, however, resists this truth. It finds comfort in imagining God as something to worship, something larger and grander than itself. It bows to a throne it has built in its imagination, forgetting that the real temple is the heart, and the real altar is the stillness within. To know that God is within is not arrogance. It is humility in its purest form. For when you see God as your very being, the you that once claimed ownership of life begins to dissolve. The false self bows to the reality of the infinite self, and in that surrender, peace descends naturally. Every act of looking outward for God strengthens the veil of separation. Every moment of quiet inward attention thins it. When you sit in silence, not seeking, not asking, but simply being, you begin to feel a presence, subtle, warm, unmoving. That presence is not yours. It is the life of God being itself. You discover that there has never been a distance to close, only a blindness to remove. The God within you is not confined by the boundaries of your personality or your body. It is not your God any more than light belongs to a single lamp. The same light shines through all. To see this is to recognize that every person, every creature, every corner of existence is an expression of the same infinite life. Once this realization dawns, judgment fades, compassion arises naturally, because you no longer see others as separate beings. You see the same presence looking back at you through countless forms. You may search for signs of God in miracles, in visions, or in holy places, yet all such searching only postpones the discovery. The truest revelation is not accompanied by thunder or glory. It comes as a quiet recognition that the divine has been living your life all along. You are not the vessel that holds God. You are the expression through which God reveals itself. Every heartbeat is a prayer, every breath an act of creation. To live with this awareness is to move through the world unafraid. The one who once felt small, vulnerable, and incomplete begins to see that there is no life apart from the life that sustains all. When you walk, God walks. When you rest, God rests. There is no moment without the holy, no place where the divine is not. The realization of this truth is not the gaining of something new. It is the remembering of what has always been so. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is the atmosphere of God's presence. In the world of noise and motion, the divine voice cannot be heard because it does not speak through words. It reveals itself in stillness, in that inner quiet where thoughts have ceased to chatter and the mind no longer rushes to interpret or define. The silence that reveals God is not created by closing the mouth or escaping the world. It is the natural quiet that appears when one no longer clings to thought. It is the space where the awareness of the eternal becomes unmistakable. The human mind is restless. It seeks knowledge, results, and reassurance. It prays with words, analyzes with logic, and measures with understanding. But God is not found in this movement. God cannot be understood, for understanding belongs to intellect, and the divine lies beyond intellect. Only when the mind has grown weary of its own effort does it begin to surrender. And in that surrender, a doorway opens, not outward but inward, leading into the infinite silence where the presence abides. That silence is not empty. It is alive, radiant, filled with a subtle energy that feels like peace itself breathing. The still mind becomes aware of a presence, unseen yet unmistakably real, that seems to hover within and around everything. This is the presence that prophets spoke of, the still small voice that Elijah heard, the quiet awareness that needs no language. It does not command or explain, it simply is. In that stillness, one realizes that there was never any distance between the soul and God. The noise of thought created the illusion of separation, and silence dissolves it effortlessly. Many people fear silence because it confronts them with themselves. When all outer distractions fade, what remains is the mind's own turmoil, the fears, desires, and unhealed wounds that noise once concealed. But if one endures this purification with patience, the turbulence settles naturally. Then, beneath the surface commotion, the deep and timeless peace of God emerges. It was always there, waiting to be recognized. Silence does not create peace, it reveals it. In the presence of silence, prayer transforms. It no longer becomes a plea or petition, but communion. Words fade because they are no longer needed. You no longer speak to God, you rest as God's awareness. The mind no longer reaches for answers because it begins to realize that the answer was never outside of this stillness. Every question dissolves in the light of this knowing. The truth that once seemed distant now breathes in your very being. When you learn to dwell in that silence, the world itself begins to change in appearance. You see movement, yet underneath it all is stillness. You hear sounds, yet you perceive the quiet foundation beneath every note. Even in the midst of chaos, an inner peace remains untouched. That peace is the signature of God, not a peace that comes and goes, but one that has never left. The spiritual path, then, is not about accumulating teachings or performing rituals, but about discovering how to be still. Not still with effort, but still because you have recognized that all effort was noise. True silence cannot be manufactured. It arises naturally when one stops striving to reach God and begins to rest in the awareness that God is already here. In that holy quiet, every barrier dissolves, time, space, and identity lose meaning. What remains is pure consciousness, vast and luminous. The silence that reveals God is not something you enter. It is what you are before you speak, before you think, before you name anything as I or God. To dwell in that awareness, even for a moment, is to experience eternity in its simplest form, still, boundless, complete. Every concept of God is a veil that hides God. The human mind, limited by form and habit, cannot bear to rest in the formless. It seeks to name, describe, and capture the infinite in words. So it builds ideas, images of power, wisdom, love, or judgment, and calls them God. Yet whatever can be imagined cannot be God. For imagination belongs to the realm of mind, and mind can only create symbols. The moment you define the divine, you confine it. The infinite cannot be held within the boundaries of a thought. Letting go of all concepts of God is not irreverence, it is the highest reverence. It is the recognition that the true cannot be contained by belief. The mind wants certainty, a picture it can cling to, a set of truths it can repeat. But real knowing begins only when that certainty dissolves. To approach the divine, one must come empty-handed, stripped of definitions and expectations. When the intellect falls silent and the heart stops searching, what remains is awareness. Pure, unconditioned, untouched by any thought of this or that. In that awareness, God reveals itself as what has always been present. It is not easy for the human mind to surrender its images. It fears the loss of structure, the death of meaning. To release one's concept of God feels like stepping into nothingness. But this nothingness is the doorway to everything real. It is not emptiness, it is fullness beyond comprehension. The mind resists because it cannot control what it cannot define. Yet the soul rejoices, for in that unknowing, it finally finds freedom. When you release all ideas about what God is, you stop separating the sacred from the ordinary. You begin to see holiness in the smallest details of life. In a breath, in a moment of stillness, in the gaze of another being. The veil of thought that once divided heaven and earth, spirit and matter, dissolves. You realize that everything you touch, see, or feel is already infused with the same divine presence. There is no this world and that world. There is only one life expressing itself in infinite forms. The mistake of humanity has always been to think it can approach God through knowledge, as if studying enough, praying enough, or believing enough could make the infinite known. But God is not known through accumulation. God is revealed through surrender. The more you think you know, the farther you drift from the truth. The moment you let go of even the desire to know, the presence floods in. It was never waiting for your understanding, it was waiting for your stillness. Letting go of concepts means releasing even the spiritual pride that says, I have seen, I have realized. The moment you claim to possess the truth, it slips through your fingers. The divine can only be lived, never owned. It moves through you like the wind, invisible yet undeniable. The ego may try to hold it, to frame it, to turn it into a teaching or philosophy, but the living presence refuses to be captured. It simply is. When you cease to define God, you begin to experience God. When you no longer seek to understand, you begin to see clearly. All that remains is awareness, boundless, luminous, unspoken. From that state, love flows without effort, compassion arises without intention, and wisdom acts without thought. This is the life of the Spirit, not clinging to ideas, but living from the quiet, knowing that needs no explanation. To let go of every concept of God is to awaken to the mystery of existence itself. A mystery that cannot be solved because it was never a problem to begin with. The wave no longer questions the ocean once it knows it is water. In the same way, the soul no longer seeks God once it realizes it has never been apart. The ideas fall away, the striving ends, and what remains is the unspoken truth, that God is, and in that being you are. When the veil of separation lifts, the revelation is not of a distant deity, but of oneness. an awareness that everything that exists is a single, seamless expression of one life, one consciousness. The mind, trained to divide and categorize, cannot comprehend such unity. It insists that there must be me and God, self and all other, heaven and earth. But the moment the heart awakens, these distinctions dissolve like mist in sunlight. The knower, the knowing, and the known merge into one reality that has no center and no boundary. In that sacred recognition, you realize that what you have always called God is not something you can approach. It is what you are. This is not a poetic idea, but a living truth that can be felt in the silence of awareness. When the mind quiets, you sense the same presence that breathes in the trees, flows in the rivers, and shines in the stars, pulsing quietly within your own being. There is no division, no barrier of identity. The same consciousness that watches from behind your eyes is the consciousness behind all eyes. The same life that animates your body animates every living thing. To know this is to see that love is not a feeling directed outward, but the natural recognition of oneself in everything. In this state of awareness, the boundaries of mine and yours, us and them, fade into meaninglessness. Every act becomes sacred because every act is the movement of the same infinite life expressing through countless forms. Compassion ceases to be a moral duty, it becomes the spontaneous flow of love from the recognition that there is no other. Forgiveness becomes effortless, for who is there to forgive when all is one? Even suffering is seen differently, not as punishment or misfortune, but as the divine rhythm moving through form, shaping consciousness, awakening depth. This realization cannot be taught, for words can only point toward it. It dawns in moments when the ego loosens its grip, and you find yourself resting in a peace that has no cause. You may be walking, breathing, or simply watching the world unfold, and suddenly you sense the quiet truth. Everything is happening within one great presence, and that presence is you. Not the personal you with a name and history, but the eternal awareness that was never born and can never die. In that moment, the search ends. The seeker disappears because the sought was never separate. The world may still appear as before, but the perception changes completely. Where once you saw conflict, now you see harmony. Where once you saw division, now you see interconnection. Even the smallest movement of life, the flutter of a leaf, the breath of a child, the sound of the wind, becomes a hymn of unity. You begin to live from that awareness, not as an effort, but as a natural way of being. Every relationship becomes a mirror of the divine meeting itself. Every challenge becomes an invitation to remember who you are. The oneness of existence is not a concept to be grasped, but an experience to be lived. It is the end of striving and the beginning of peace. When you know that the same presence that lives you also lives all creation, fear loses its foundation. There is no longer anything to defend, nothing to achieve, nothing to prove. Life moves as it will, and you move with it, effortlessly. The river does not resist its flow, it simply expresses the nature of water. In the same way, when you awaken to this unness, you express the nature of spirit, love, peace, and infinite stillness in motion. In this realization, the idea of separation becomes impossible. You do not have life, you are life. You do not know God, you are the knowing through which God reveals itself. And in that recognition, all striving ends, all fear fades, and what remains is the eternal truth, one life, one consciousness, one love, forever expressing itself as all that is. And so, when the search for God ends, what is left is not emptiness but fullness beyond measure. You begin to see that every breath, every heartbeat, every quiet moment is the living testimony of the divine presence. The God you sought outside was never absent. It was the life looking through your own eyes, the silence beneath every sound, the peace behind every thought. When all beliefs, concepts, and separations fall away, what remains is a still awareness that whispers without words. I am. In that sacred recognition, there is nothing more to seek and nothing more to know. The veil of duality dissolves, and what stands revealed is the eternal truth, that God is not apart from you, nor you from God. The seeker and the sought are one, the wave and the ocean inseparable, the human and the divine the same timeless essence expressing us all. And in that wordless communion, you finally understand, not through thought, but through being, that to know God is simply to be still, and to know I am that I am.